Imagine holding a winning lottery ticket, like not just any ticket, but a piece of paper that guarantees you the biggest jackpot in human history.
Right, the ultimate prize.
Exactly. It promises unimaginable wealth, global influence, and the kind of geopolitical power that literally rewrites the future of your entire civilization. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
And this is a big one. The ticket is cursed. Almost whoever tries to cash it in ends up completely bankrupt, burned to the ground, or, well, in thousands of cases, dead.
It's a remarkably consistent track record, yeah.
You'd think, looking at that track record, people would eventually stop trying to cash it in, right? They tear it up, but they don't. Because the prize is just too alluring.
Human nature is stubborn that way.
It really is. So, today, for you listening, we are looking at a historical lottery ticket that destroyed two completely different empires within the span of just 30 years. We are talking about a 50-mile strip of dense, unforgiving jungle in the Western Hemisphere, the Isthmus of Panama.
It was, without a doubt, the ultimate geographic choke point. The sheer concentration of disaster, of human misery, and economic collapse that occurred within those 50 miles is just staggering.
And what's wild is that it wasn't an accident.
No, not at all. The geography actively invited the chaos.
To really understand this, we have a massive stack of sources on the table for you today in this deep dive. We are pulling from deep historical dossiers, primary accounts, including the highly contested diaries of a buccaneer named Alexander Exquemelin, and some incredibly granular modern economic analyses of 17th century shipping lanes and national debt.
The economic data really grounds the story, I think.
It does. Our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how this tiny sliver of terrain served as the prize that caused massive personal suffering, devastated entire economies, and literally redrew the map of Europe. All right, let's unpack this. How does a 50-mile span of tropical trees hold so much destructive power?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to understand the geopolitical reality of the late 17th century. The Isthmus of Panama was, without exaggeration, the most contested piece of geography on Earth. Financiers and kings referred to it at the time as the key of the universe.
The key of the universe. That is quite a title.
It really shows you how they viewed it. It functioned as the singular land bridge connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That meant it was the funnel for the wealth of the Americas.
Right.
If Spain wanted to move massive quantities of Peruvian silver or trade goods from their Asian colonies back to Europe, they couldn't just sail through the continent. They had to offload it on the Pacific coast, haul it by mule across those 50 miles of jungle to the Caribbean side, and reload it onto galleons.
Which is an insane logistical bottleneck.
Exactly. Whoever held that 50-mile strip held the global economy by the throat.
Which makes it a magnet for anyone with a ship and a sword. If all the wealth of an empire has to squeeze through one hallway, you don't attack the vault. You wait in the hallway.
That is the exact strategic vulnerability we're looking at today. We're going to focus on two linked historical disasters that occurred right at that choke point, both illustrating the devastating consequences of trying to control it.
Which disaster specifically?
First, the 1671 destruction of the original Panama City, Panamá Viejo, by a massive force of pirates. And second, occurring just under 30 years later, the catastrophic Scottish Darien Scheme of 1698.
I really want to emphasize to you, the listener, why you should care about this sequence of events. This isn't just dusty, distant history about, men in funny hats.
Far from it.
This is a masterclass in how geography dictates human destiny. It shows us the terrifying fragility of global supply chains, like how a single bottleneck can collapse an empire's economy almost overnight, and how terrible, unchecked financial investments can literally erase entire sovereign nations from existence.
It is a story of profound hubris.
And to see that hubris in action, we need to travel back to the gathering storm of July 1670. Spain and England are attempting to alter the geopolitical landscape. They sit down and they sign the Treaty of Madrid.
Right, which was supposed to be a monumental paradigm shift. For decades, Spain had claimed almost the entire New World as its exclusive property.
They just claimed all of it.
Basically, yeah.
But with this treaty, Spain finally officially recognized England's presence and its Caribbean colonies like Jamaica. And in exchange, the English crown agreed to definitively suppress piracy in the region.
So on paper, this is the end of an era. The age of state-sponsored privateers, the guys with official letters from the king giving them permission to rob Spanish ships, that's supposed to be over. They're trying to legitimize their borders and calm the waters.
That was the diplomatic intention in London and Madrid, absolutely. But out in the Caribbean, the reality on the ground, or the water rather, was entirely different.
Enter Henry Morgan. Yes. A Welsh privateer named Henry Morgan was busy mustering a massive invasion force. He gathered his fleet at Tortuga, an island off the coast of Hispaniola. And to understand the scale here, this wasn't just a handful of rogue ships looking for a quick raid.
No, it was massive.
Morgan managed to assemble roughly 37 ships and an estimated 2,000 men.
I want to pause on that number for a second. 2,000 armed men on 37 ships? That is not a pirate crew. That is a rogue navy.
It absolutely is an army.
How do you even feed a force that size while they're just sitting around waiting to deploy? The logistical nightmare of just organizing that in the 1670s must have been immense.
The logistics were staggering, and it required entirely stripping local islands of provisions. Morgan was operating on the scale of a sovereign military commander, and his target justified that scale.
He was aiming for the big one.
He aimed for Panamá Viejo, the crown jewel of the Pacific coast. It was the administrative and financial hub where all that Peruvian silver was aggregated before making the overland journey.
But there is a massive geographical problem here. Panamá Viejo is on the Pacific side. Morgan is in the Caribbean. He can't just sail his 37 ships up to the city walls.
No, he's blocked by the landmass.
Right, so he has to park his fleet, get his men off the boats, and physically cross the isthmus.
Which means navigating the Camino de Cruces. This was the primary overland trail through the jungle. In January 1671, Morgan takes roughly 1,400 of his most capable buccaneers and begins the march.
And this is where it gets awful.
We really have to separate this from the popular image of a surgical, quick-strike pirate raid. This was a slow, agonizing, full-scale infantry invasion moving through dense, unforgiving tropical terrain.
Wait, let me make sure I'm picturing this correctly. They are marching 1,400 men into a dense, mosquito-filled, suffocatingly humid jungle.
Yes.
They are dragging heavy muskets, powder, shot, and artillery. And from what I understand in the sources, they brought almost no food with them.
Very little.
Yeah. That sounds like signing up for an ultra-marathon where the organizers have intentionally set the water stations on fire. Why would an experienced commander like Morgan risk starvation?
Because he expected to forage and capture Spanish supply caches along the route. That was standard operational procedure for moving large forces in this era. You eat the enemy's food.
Right, live off the land.
But the Spanish governor, Juan Pérez de Guzmán, was highly competent and fully aware Morgan was coming. He implemented a ruthless but strategically brilliant scorched earth defense.
Hold on. If Guzmán knew Morgan was coming, and these pirates are marching single file through a dense, miserable jungle, why not just ambush them in the trees?
That seems obvious, right?
Yeah. A few hundred men in the brush could decimate a column of exhausted pirates. Why retreat and burn things?
That is a very natural assumption to make. But Guzmán knew he was dealing with hardened, veteran buccaneers who excelled at irregular close-quarters combat in broken terrain.
Ah, so they were good at jungle fighting.
Exactly. Engaging Morgan's men in a chaotic jungle skirmish played directly to the pirates' strengths. Guzmán's strategy was to use the jungle itself as a weapon.
How so?
As the Spanish retreated ahead of Morgan's army, they stripped the trail of absolutely anything useful. They burned the maize crops, they destroyed the storehouses, they evacuated all the livestock.
Wow.
By the time Morgan's men arrived at any settlement or rest stop, there was nothing left but smoking ash and mud.
Which fundamentally changes the biology of the march. You have 1,400 heavily armed men walking into a green oven. They are sweating profusely, burning thousands of calories a day, hacking through underbrush, and the environment provides zero caloric intake.
And the primary accounts, especially Alexander Exquemelin's book, The Buccaneers of America, describe the personal suffering of the men in harrowing detail.
I read some of those excerpts. It's rough.
It is a grim look at the physiological breakdown of an army. They were reduced to the absolute brink of starvation within days. They began eating random jungle leaves, gambling on whether they were poisonous, just hoping to find something digestible.
And didn't they eat dogs?
Yes, when they found stray dogs that the Spanish had inadvertently left behind, they slaughtered and ate them immediately.
And when the stray dogs run out, the sources mentioned them eating their own leather belts and shoes. I read that and initially thought it was a myth, an exaggeration. Biologically, how does a human stomach process an old, tanned leather belt?
Well, it can't process it in its raw state. Exquemelin explicitly detailed the survival mechanics of this. The starving men would take their leather belts or leather sackles, slice them into tiny strips, and then violently beat those strips with stones to break down the hardened fibers.
Oh my God.
Then they would soak the pulverized leather in whatever river water they could find to soften it further, scrape off the hair or dirt, and then either roast it over a fire or boil it into a hideous gelatinous broth.
That is disgusting. And I imagine it has zero nutrition.
It provided almost zero nutritional value, yes. But it tricked the stomach into feeling full, staving off the physical agony of hunger pangs.
The psychological toll of boiling your own shoes just to keep marching cannot be overstated. You have men hallucinating from hunger, likely suffering from dysentery from drinking bad water covered in insect bites.
A total nightmare.
By the time they finally break through the dense jungle canopy and emerge onto the open savanna outside Panamá Viejo, this isn't a military formation. It's a starving, desperate mob of skeletal figures.
Yet, they maintain their cohesion. And as they emerge from the tree line on January 28, 1671, they face the grim reality of their situation. Standing between them and the wealth of the city is a fully armed, well-fed Spanish defense force.
This brings us to the Battle of Mataasnios. The Spanish governor, Guzman, has drawn up a field army of about 1,600 men on the open savanna.
He's ready for them.
He has the numerical advantage. His men have been eating regular meals. He has a cavalry unit. And he is defending his home turf. By all conventional military metrics, the pirates should be slaughtered.
Guzman held every tactical advantage. But rather than rely purely on his infantry and cavalry to crush a weakened enemy, he decides to deploy a highly unorthodox defense mechanism.
Unorthodox is one word for it.
He had ordered his men to gather a massive herd of cattle hundreds, perhaps well over 1,000 wild bulls and cows from the surrounding ranches. His gambit was to drive this enormous panicked herd directly into the buccaneer lines.
I have to stop you there because the mental image is just absurd. Weaponizing cows against a line of battle-hardened, heavily armed men.
I know, it sounds crazy.
These are pirates who have literally been eating your own belts for a week, and Guzman's master plan is to throw 1,000 pounds of walking steak at them. It sounds like he's throwing a buffet at a starving army.
It sounds absurd to modern ears, but we have to look at the military logic of the era. Using large animals to break infantry lines is an ancient tactic. Think of war elephants in antiquity.
Okay, sure, elephants. But cows?
Guzman knew that 17th century warfare relied entirely on tight, disciplined infantry formations. If you break the line, the army routes. A stampede of 1,000 terrified, 1,000-pound animals charging at full speed is essentially biological heavy cavalry. If it hits an infantry line, it shatters it.
Okay, the mechanical logic of a 1,000-pound animal acting as a battering ram makes sense. But an animal isn't a cannonball. It has a brain, and it has a survival instinct.
Which was the fatal flaw in the plan. As the Spanish drovers pushed the cattle toward the pirate lines, Morgan's men didn't panic, and they didn't break formation. They held their ground and fired massive, coordinated musket volleys directly into the charging herd.
Just a wall of lead.
The deafening, thunderous roar of hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously, the thick clouds of black powder smoke rolling across the grass, and the sudden, violent deaths of the lead bulls caused a massive chain reaction of panic among the animals.
Right, because the cattle do the math. They see fire and noise in front of them, so they turn around to run away from it.
Exactly. The entire herd wheeled around in terror and stampeded back the way they came, directly into the tightly packed Spanish ranks.
Wow.
The Spanish army is suddenly being trampled by their own biological weapon. Total chaos ensues. The Spanish lines are completely shattered. Men are thrown to the ground. Formations dissolve.
It's an utter catastrophe for the defense. Morgan's men, despite being so starved they can barely stand, have immense combat discipline. They just reload and keep firing into the scattered, panicked Spanish defenders.
The defense collapses entirely. The survivors flee into the surrounding countryside, and Panamá Viejo, the great vault of the Pacific, falls to the buccaneers.
They actually did it.
They did. But the victory is immediately eclipsed by the ultimate tragedy. Almost as soon as the pirates take control, the city, this magnificent wooden metropolis that represented the absolute pinnacle of Spanish wealth and power in the Americas, catches fire. It burns completely to the ground.
Wait, so who actually lit the match? Because if I'm a pirate who just marched through hell to steal a city's treasure, I'm definitely not burning down the very houses I'm trying to loot.
That makes logical sense, yes.
But if I'm the Spanish governor, I'm also not eager to admit I burned down my own capital.
And that is precisely the root of a major historical dispute. The question of who sparked the inferno is fiercely debated, and we have to examine the primary sources impartially because they contradict each other entirely. we have two distinct perspectives born out of the fog of war.
Let's lay out the evidence. Perspective one.
Perspective one comes from Morgan and his command staff. They vehemently claimed that the fleeing Spanish governor, Guzman, deliberately ordered his own slaves and soldiers to blow up the powder magazines and set torches to the major buildings.
A denial of resources.
Right. According to Morgan, it was a final, spiteful act of scorched earth. The logic being, if Spain couldn't keep the city and its wealth, neither could the pirates.
Which honestly tracks perfectly with his earlier strategy. He burned every scrap of food and every shelter on the Camino de Cruces to deny the pirates resources. Burning the city is just the macro version of that strategy.
The tactical consistency is definitely there. But we must weigh that against perspective two.
Okay, what's perspective two?
The Spanish accounts place the blame squarely on the pirates. Crucially, this perspective is supported by Alexander Excomelon, who, remember, was a buccaneer actually on the expedition.
Oh, an insane source.
Yes. In his chronicles, he claimed that Morgan's men started the fire. He suggested it was either an act of sheer vindictive malice by the pirates or, more likely, a result of drunken, reckless carelessness as starving men broke into the wine cellars and began wildly looting a wooden city with open torches.
You know, the fog of war is thick here. The truth was quite literally lost in the smoke. We may never definitively know if it was a calculated Spanish denial tactic or a pirate celebration gone catastrophically wrong.
Exactly.
But the consequence is undisputed. The destruction was absolute. Thousands of homes, warehouses, and convents were reduced to ash and stone foundations.
And the physical ash of that city quickly ignited a massive diplomatic crisis back in Europe.
Right, because we have to remember the timeline we established at the beginning. Just months prior, England and Spain signed the Treaty of Madrid, officially promising peace and an end to piracy.
Yes.
Now, a massive English privateer force has just incinerated the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire.
It created an immediate geopolitical nightmare for London. The raid was a blatant, explosive violation of the treaty. Spanish diplomats in London were absolutely furious. They demanded answers, restitution, and Morgan's head.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I'm looking at this timeline, and something doesn't add up. The treaty is signed in Europe in July 1670. Morgan begins his march in January 1671.
Correct.
Are you telling me that in those 6 months, no one from London sent a fast ship to tell the guy commanding 2,000 armed men to stand down? Did Morgan actually know the treaty was in effect before he set sail?
That remains the million-dollar historical question. And again, historians are divided largely because of the logistical realities of 17th century transatlantic communication.
It was slow, right?
Incredibly slow. A ship leaving London could take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks just to cross the ocean, depending on prevailing winds. Once in the Caribbean, they would have to track down Morgan, who was actively moving between hideouts and mustering points.
So he might not have known.
Several historians maintain that it is entirely plausible the official news of the July Treaty had not firmly reached him by October when he began gathering his fleet, or even by January when he marched.
It is plausible deniability at its absolute finest. It's like, sorry I didn't get the memo until after the city was ashes.
Exactly. Whether Morgan truly knew or was just playing deaf, the English government had to perform diplomatic triage to save the treaty.
So what did they do?
They issued warrants, arrested Henry Morgan, put him in chains, and shipped him back across the Atlantic to face justice in London for his rogue actions.
So the Spanish get what they want. The pirate who broke the treaty and burned the city is going to the gallows.
You would think so.
But this is where the sheer hypocrisy of empire comes into play. Instead of a hanging, Morgan gets a slap on the wrist. Actually, it's vastly better than that. He is eventually knighted by King Charles II and then placed on a ship back to the Caribbean as the newly appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica.
It is a stunning display of realpolitik. The English crown went through the theatrical motions of condemning him to pacify Spanish outrage.
Just a show.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But privately, they recognized that Morgan's brutal success had thoroughly exposed the vulnerability of the Spanish Empire. They rewarded him for advancing English imperial interests and proving that their global rival was effectively hollow.
It's the ultimate, he's a pirate, but he's our pirate defense. So Sir Henry Morgan goes back to Jamaica to drink rum and govern, while Spain is left sweeping up the ashes of their economy.
Quite literally.
Let's talk about the economic fallout. How does an empire recover from losing its primary transit hub?
The devastation was not just physical. It was systemic and long-term. First, they faced the immediate geographical problem of the city itself. The original site of Panamá Viejo was flat, open, and clearly indefensible against a massive land force.
Obviously, since a bunch of starving guys just took it.
Right. So in 1673, the Spanish officially abandoned the Ashes and relocated the capital about 5 miles down the coast to a rocky peninsula. They built Casco Viejo, surrounding it with massive heavy stone walls. They engineered it to be an unconquerable fortress.
And militarily, it worked. Nobody ever sapped Casco Viejo the way Morgan sacked the old city. But there's a tragic irony here. They spent fortunes building a perfectly impenetrable vault, but the gold and silver they meant to store inside it simply stopped arriving.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that points to something much deeper. Morgan's raid fundamentally broke the illusion of Spanish invulnerability. It exposed the extreme brittleness of Spain's centralized fleet system.
How so?
Well, for decades, Spain had required all colonial wealth to be aggregated and moved in massive, heavily guarded annual convoys through single choke points. Morgan proved that funneling the entire wealth of South America through a single, undefendable 50-mile jungle corridor was a strategic liability of catastrophic proportions.
So Spain makes a monumental decision. They change the map of global shipping.
Driven by sheer terror of further privateer invasions, Spain began routing their South American silver away from the Panamanian Isthmus entirely.
Which is a huge detour.
Enormous. Instead of sailing up the Pacific coast of Panama, they started loading the silver fleets and sailing them all the way down the western coast, around the incredibly treacherous icy waters of Cape Horn at the very bottom of South America, and then back up the Atlantic.
To put that in modern terms, imagine the supply chain crisis when the Suez Canal was blocked a few years ago. Global shipping had to suddenly reroute all the way around the continent of Africa, adding weeks of travel, immense danger, and massive costs. Spain voluntarily inflicted that exact logistical nightmare on themselves just to avoid the 50 miles of Panama.
And the economic consequence for Panama was starvation. We begin to see the slow, agonizing death of the legendary Portobelo fairs.
Right, the big trading hubs.
Yes. For generations, these massive trade fairs on the Caribbean side of the Isthmus were the economic heartbeat of the Spanish Empire. It was where the silver arriving from the jungle trails was traded for European-manufactured goods. But without the silver funneling through the choke point, the fairs dwindled. They became smaller, irregular, and desperate.
The vibrant, wealthy towns along the old route just wither away. The highway has been bypassed.
The final, fatal blow to the system came decades later in 1739, when British Admiral Edward Vernon captured the port of Portobelo. That event effectively ended the Spanish galleon and fair system forever. The economic engine of Spanish Panama ground to a permanent halt.
So if we pull back and look at the board, Spain is bleeding out, their monopoly is shattered, their primary trade route is abandoned to the jungle, and a massive economic vacuum forms in Panama.
Yes.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Into this void steps a completely unexpected player. Not a rival superpower like France or England, but a desperate, freezing kingdom 5,000 miles away, looking for a miracle to save itself.
We're shifting the narrative timeline forward now to the late 1690s, focusing heavily on the internal crisis within the Kingdom of Scotland.
To understand why Scotland would even look toward a mosquito-infested jungle in Central America, you have to understand the depth of their domestic despair.
It was profound.
The 1690s in Scotland were defined by what they called the ill years. It was a period of catastrophic weather leading to consecutive failed harvests. We are talking about widespread, devastating famine. And politically, they are trapped. They share a monarch with England, King William III, but they are a separate, sovereign nation, and England has implemented the Navigation Acts.
What's fascinating here is that the Navigation Acts were a series of laws designed to tightly control trade within the English Empire, and they explicitly categorized Scotland as a foreign entity.
Which means they were locked out.
Entirely. This meant Scottish merchants were legally barred from trading with the highly lucrative English colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean. If a Scottish ship tried to dock and trade in Jamaica, it could be seized.
Wow.
Scotland was essentially locked out of the exploding global economy, watching the wealth of the world pass them by while their own people starved.
Desperation breeds audacity. A nation facing famine and economic exclusion needs a lifeline. And into this bleak landscape walks a man named William Paterson.
Paterson was a highly influential, deeply serious economic thinker. He was a financier who had already proven his brilliance by helping to found the Bank of England.
So he wasn't just some fringe guy.
No, he intimately understood the mechanics of global capital and trade flows. And he saw Scotland's isolation not as a permanent condition, but as a problem to be solved with one massive visionary swing.
Patterson delivers a pitch that must have sounded like absolute salvation. He proposes creating a sovereign Scottish colony, which he dubs New Caledonia, located right on the Darien coast of Panama.
Right.
His argument is brilliant in its simplicity. The Spanish have abandoned the isthmus out of fear. If Scotland can plant a colony there, they can control the overland trade route themselves. They can act as the neutral middleman connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, completely bypassing the monopolies of both Spain and the English East India Company. He is the one who popularized calling the isthmus the key of the universe.
It was an incredibly compelling economic thesis. In theory, establishing a free trade port at the narrowest point between two oceans would revolutionize global commerce. However, the geopolitical reality was a brick wall. King William III immediately identified the scheme as a massive threat.
Because King William wears two crowns, but his priorities are strictly English.
Exactly. William's primary geopolitical concern was the looming war in Europe against France. To survive that, he desperately needed the Spanish Empire as an ally.
And Spain still claims Panama.
Yes. The absolute last thing he wanted was his Scottish subjects invading territory that Spain still legally claimed. Furthermore, powerful lobbying forces in London, particularly the English East India Company, viewed a Scottish free trade port as a direct existential threat to their own Asian trade monopolies.
So the king uses his executive power to kill the funding.
He issues aggressive directives forbidding any English investors from putting capital into the Scottish venture. And he doesn't stop there. He uses English diplomatic leverage across Europe in financial hubs like Amsterdam and Hamburg to threaten foreign investors. The message was clear. If you fund the Scots, you make an enemy of England.
The institutional venture capital is entirely cut off. Patterson has a grand vision, a charter, but no money. So what does a desperate startup do? They pivot to retail investors. The Company of Scotland opens subscription books directly to the Scottish public, and the response is a phenomenon that defies logic.
It triggered a national mania. Because of the English blockade, investing in the Darien Scheme ceased to be just a financial decision. It became an act of profound patriotism.
A way to stick it to the English king.
Exactly. It was Scotland's chance to defy the English king, assert their sovereignty, and secure their own economic destiny. The public, driven by national pride and sheer economic desperation, rushed to sign the subscription books.
From top to bottom.
Yes. Landowners mortgaged their estates, merchants emptied their vaults, and even ordinary citizens pooled their meager savings to buy shares.
I really want to frame the scale of this for you. Modern estimates suggest that Scotland sank roughly 20%, with some economic historians arguing it was up to 40%, or nearly a quarter of the entire nation's available liquid capital into this single venture.
They raised an astonishing £400,000 sterling. To put that in context, for a country the size of Scotland, suffering through the ill years, that figure represents an almost inconceivable concentration of national wealth.
Let me get this straight. Let's ground this in a modern analogy. Imagine a struggling nation today, burdened by debt and a failing agricultural sector, deciding to take a quarter of its entire GDP and invest it into a single, highly speculative cryptocurrency exchange. Or betting half their national wealth in building a colony on Mars, a place no one in the government has ever visited. If it fails, the nation goes bankrupt. What was the contingency plan?
There was none. The tragedy of the Darien Scheme is that the risk assessment was practically non-existent. The entire financial future of a sovereign nation was wagered on a map coordinate that the investors had only seen in Patterson's optimistic brochures.
Raising that astronomical sum of money was the easy part. The real nightmare begins when they actually load the ships. In November 1698, a fleet of 5 ships carrying roughly 1,200 Scottish settlers finally arrives off the coast of the Darien.
They disembark, naming their landing site New Caledonia, and begin constructing a fort and a settlement they call New Edinburgh. And almost immediately upon stepping into the jungle, the brutal, unyielding reality of their geography sets in.
The profound disconnect between the planners in Scotland and the reality of a tropical rainforest is staggering. You have these investors sitting in cold, rainy, windswept Edinburgh trying to imagine what people living in a Panamanian jungle might want to purchase.
It's tragic, honestly.
Let's look at the cargo manifests. What did they pack in their holds to trade for food and survival? Heavy woolen cloth, thousands of bone combs, powdered wigs, and massive crates of Bibles printed in English.
It highlights a complete failure of intelligence gathering. They arrived equipped to trade in a European temperate climate market. They brought items that were utterly, fundamentally useless in a tropical environment characterized by extreme heat and humidity.
Completely useless.
More critically, they brought almost no agricultural equipment or practical expertise suited for clearing and farming dense jungle terrain. The business model relied entirely on trading their manufactured goods with locals to secure their food supply.
But trade requires two willing participants, and this brings us to a massively important, often overlooked part of the story. The Darien was not an empty stretch of wilderness waiting for European salvation. It was the ancestral sovereign home of the indigenous Guna people.
The role of the Guna is vital to understanding the collapse of the colony. The Guna possessed immense agency and political sophistication. They did not immediately attack the Scots. Rather, they observed them.
They just watched them.
They watched these 1,200 settlers arrive, sweating profusely in their heavy wool garments, struggling to clear the dense undergrowth, and slowly realizing they couldn't feed themselves.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Guna leader. You are standing in 90-degree heat with 80% humidity. A group of starving, sunburned Europeans approaches you and offers to trade you a powdered wig and a heavy wool coat in exchange for your hard-earned crops.
The Guna simply exercised their own economic judgment. They politely but firmly declined.
I mean, wouldn't you?
Of course. They had spent decades expertly navigating the violent tensions between the Spanish Empire and English privateers. They understood regional geopolitics, and they instantly recognized a terrible, unsustainable trade deal when they saw one.
So they didn't help them at all.
While they occasionally provided small amounts of food out of pity or to foster a temporary strategic alliance against the Spanish, they had absolutely no intention of becoming the agricultural supply chain for a doomed, poorly planned European colony.
So the Scottish settlers can't trade for food because their goods are useless. They can't grow their own food because they don't understand the soil or the climate. They begin to starve. But starvation, as horrific as it is, wasn't the primary killer. The true conqueror of New Caledonia was microscopic.
The ultimate devastation came from disease. Yellow fever, malaria, and severe dysentery swept through the encampment with terrifying speed. We have to look at the biology of this. The Scottish settlers possessed absolutely no natural immunity to these specific tropical pathogens.
Right.
In the Caribbean at the time, there was a concept known as seasoning, a brutal period where a new arrival either survived their first bout of tropical fever and gained some resistance, or died. The Scots arrived unseasoned, dropping into an environment dense with mosquito vectors they didn't understand.
The personal suffering detailed in the diaries from that camp is incredibly bleak. You have to imagine the sheer horror of the situation. You are a young Scot who traveled across an ocean carrying your family's life savings, hoping to build a new world. Within weeks of landing, the torrential rains begin.
The dampness was everywhere.
Your wooden forts are rotting in the mud. You are too physically weak from hunger to even forage or fish. And every single day, you are watching your friends, your family, and your leaders die in agony from fevers.
It was an apocalyptic scenario. The sheer volume of graves they were forced to dig into the mud overwhelmed the survivors.
The body count of this expedition is difficult to process. Let's look at the numbers.
We must be measured when discussing these figures, as historical demographers and historians continue to debate the exact totals. This is primarily because the official ship logs, medical records, and passenger manifests were often incomplete, deliberately altered to hide the scale of the disaster, or simply lost to the sea during the chaotic retreats.
Okay, but what's the best estimate?
Looking across the entire Darien Scheme, which comprised two separate major expeditions, totaling between roughly 2,500 to 3,000 settlers, modern estimates suggest that roughly 2,000 people died.
That is an 80% mortality rate. 8 out of every 10 people who boarded a ship in Scotland with dreams of empire died in that jungle or on the disease-ridden ships trying to flee it.
And those who somehow survived the fevers and the starvation were ultimately forced to capitulate.
How did it end?
The Spanish, realizing the colony was barely clinging to life, finally dispatched a military force. They laid siege to the rotting fort of New Edinburgh, and the disease-broken remnants of the Scottish expedition surrendered and limped back across the Atlantic.
The ships returned to Scotland. The news spreads, which forces us to ask a profound question about national resilience. How does a sovereign country recover when it loses 2,000 of its youngest, most ambitious citizens and up to a quarter of its entire national wealth in a single, colossal failure?
So what does this all mean? The blunt historical reality is that they couldn't recover. The domestic fallout within Scotland was absolute, unmitigated devastation. The Darien disaster essentially eradicated the Scottish investing class.
Just wiped them out.
The wealth of the nobles, the accumulated capital of the merchants, the collective savings of entire towns, all of it vanished into the Panamanian mud. It completely gutted the nation's finances at the exact moment they were already deeply weakened by years of famine.
This isn't just a sad story about bad investments. This has massive geopolitical consequences for the map of Europe. You now have a sovereign nation sitting on the northern border of England that is effectively insolvent.
This profound financial ruin forced Scotland's hand politically. For generations, there had been intense, recurring debates about entering into a closer political union with the vastly wealthier Kingdom of England.
But they always resisted it, right?
Yes, fiercely proud Scottish independence and a long history of warfare always resisted those calls. Now, however, the economic reality was inescapable. The national ledger was empty. The Darien failure became the ultimate undeniable catalyst for those political factions urging union.
They reached a point where they literally could not afford the cost of being an independent country anymore.
Exactly. This crushing financial pressure leads directly to the 1707 Act of Union. The Scottish Parliament met in Edinburgh, debated the grim reality of their insolvency, and literally voted themselves out of existence as an independent legislative body.
That's a massive moment in history.
It is. They agreed to fuse with England to create a single, unified entity, Great Britain.
But the English didn't just absorb a bankrupt neighbor out of the goodness of their hearts. Part of that treaty, part of the Act of Union, was a very specific, highly calculated financial settlement, a mechanism called the equivalent. I want to understand how that actually worked.
The equivalent was a massive cash payment. The English Treasury agreed to pay exactly £398,085 sterling to Scotland.
Very specific number.
It was. And the mechanics of this are fascinating because a significant portion of that capital was explicitly earmarked to directly compensate the shareholders of the Company of Scotland for their catastrophic losses in the Darien Scheme. English agents physically arrived with carts of gold and silver to pay out the claims.
Wow, it was a sovereign bailout. England essentially bought Scottish political independence by paying off the toxic debt generated in a Panamanian swamp.
We must introduce a necessary layer of historical nuance here, though. It would be a dangerous oversimplification to claim that the Darien disaster was the sole cause of the creation of the United Kingdom. History is rarely that clean.
Right, there's always more to it.
There were massive concurrent pressures. England needed dynastic security to ensure a Protestant succession to the throne and prevent Scotland from allying with Catholic France. And Scottish elites desperately wanted legal access to the booming English trade markets.
Right, a nation's history isn't just one falling domino.
It isn't. But this raises an important question. Historians universally agree that Darien was the critical, accelerating catalyst. Without the sudden, total collapse of Scottish financial independence caused by the Darien losses, the political resistance to union would likely have endured much longer.
It is wild when you zoom out and look at the grand narrative of what we've unpacked today. In the span of just 30 years, this tiny 50-mile intensely humid choke point of geography fundamentally altered the trajectory of two massive global powers.
It's hard to overstate its impact.
First, it broke the Spanish illusion of invincibility. Morgan's raid exposed that the empire hoarding the wealth of the world couldn't even protect its own front door. It forced Spain to abandon their primary, most efficient trade routes, pushing them into a slow, centuries-long economic decline.
And then, less than a generation later, that exact same jungle absorbed a fifth of a nation's wealth and completely bankrupted a sovereign Scotland.
Just swallowed it whole.
Yes. It forced them to surrender their political independence, which in turn paved the way for the creation of Great Britain, fundamentally shifting the balance of power in Europe for the next 2 centuries.
The human and economic costs we've looked at are staggering. Think about the physical realities of what happened in that tiny stretch of land. The smoking ashes of Panamá Viejo, the starving pirates violently crushing their own leather belts with stones just to survive a jungle march.
The misery was profound.
The 2,000 Scottish graves dug into the relentless mud of the Darien, filled with people who died shivering from fever while surrounded by crates of powdered wigs. And through it all, the indigenous Guna people, quietly observing the madness of these empires, refusing to participate in their own destruction and outlasting them all.
We've seen men try to conquer this land by brute military force, and we've seen financiers try to tame it with massive infusions of capital. Both strategies were entirely broken by the brutal, unyielding realities of the geography and the microscopic diseases it harbored.
Geography always wins.
It does. It leaves you with a lingering, somewhat terrifying thought. If unchecked military violence and the entire wealth of a nation couldn't tame this 50-mile strip of jungle, what kind of staggering technological arrogance would it eventually take for humanity to look at that land and decide to actually cut it in half?
That is exactly what we will explore as we move forward. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the unseen historical forces that shape our world today. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can hold is a winning ticket.